Hey guys, it's Courtney Carson from Cosmic Clarity Astrology. And in honor of 6 years on YouTube, today I'm going to be offering a new type of video. Apologies for my voice. I am actually recovering from a cold that just won't go away. But today we're going to have, again, a different style of video where we're going to be discussing the astrology of somebody's downfall. And we've all watched people in our collective society exploit others, take advantage of others, coerce others, deceive others, and continue to make money or rise in fame or power. But there are moments, there are turning points that we can detect in the astrology where a person will have a fall from grace or some kind of karmic retribution for the acts that they've committed against others. Sure, not everyone is going to go through one of these major kind of moments in life, but I do think a lot of the times these things will catch up with us, including on our own personal level, because we've all done things that we're maybe not proud of or things that have made mistakes that do karmically catch up with us, even if it's on a much smaller and gentler scale. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first person we're going to be looking at is Jeffrey Epstein. I'm sure you guys have heard of him. He's very infamous. And he was born into a middle-class family in Brooklyn, New York. Jeffrey has always been a very charismatic, a very smart, intelligent person. He was able to skip a few grades in high school. He also tutored some fellow students to gain a little bit more cash. And he went on to university but didn't end up graduating, and which is funny because he actually ended up becoming a math teacher at Dalton High School, which was a prep school for kind of rich kids in New York who had, family connections and things of that nature. So he was able to use his charm to get into places like this, even though he wasn't qualified, technically when it came to degrees, having the right degrees. And this is something that we can see in his astrology chart because he is a Capricorn rising. And as a Capricorn rising, Saturn is going to be the planet that describes his personality in the way that people perceive him. Because the rising sign is the most front-facing part of our chart besides the sun. So as a Saturn in Libra individual, because again, Saturn describes how people see him, we know that people are going to see him through Libra lens. And Libra is all about relationships. It's about being charming. And especially because his Saturn is next to Neptune, he's going to have this way of creating an illusion or even a fantasy for people. Neptune is a planet of deception. And so in many ways, he was able to kind of put on these different roles, these different characters, becoming who people wanted him to be or who he knew he needed to be in order to, succeed at some endeavor. So when he went to go get a job at this high school, it was purely through his charm that was able to land him that role. And even a parent there vouched for him and was saying just how special he really was. But again, that is some kind of image that he painted of himself. And Neptune is also the planet of actors. So in a way, he really was acting and, again, playing or stepping into the role of who people needed him to be for him to get what he wanted from them. So he went on in this role, but eventually the farce gave out because obviously he wasn't really right for the job and he wasn't properly educated. So he was eventually let go. But during his time there, he planted a seed of what he wanted to do, which was to exploit young women and go to these high schools to kind of hunt for them or pick up the vulnerable women who had maybe artistic dreams or who wanted something out of their life. So he started to plant those seeds quite young because he was only 21 when he started teaching at that high school. And he was already being inappropriate with the women in his class. He was going to, high school parties and talking to women and just, I shouldn't even say women, I should say girls, because I really hate when people say that for, children. These were children, these were girls. And that was what his, sick fascination was with youth and with young girls. So this carried over when he went and got a job in the financial sector. Some people say it was through some type of connection with one of the parents at the school that he worked at, since they did all come from wealthy families, they likely had some kind of recommendation for him. But he joined the financial sector as a result of that and was able to work his way up and start making more and more money. And in turn, he started to gain more and more power. And from this place, he was able to buy properties around the world and things that became, I guess, a haven, or places that became a haven for his nefarious deeds. So he was able to get an island, for example, or, his plane where he would later bring young girls, I keep saying ladies or women, where he would bring young girls, to be exploited sexually. So one of the things that we can see in Epstein's chart is this kind of insatiable desire when it comes to sexual preference. And this is something that we're going to talk about quite a bit today through these different cases. But this is something that we see really common when we have a kind of jacked up Venus in somebody's chart, or Jupiter, or even Mars, because there is an appetite that can never fully be quenched, a thirst, I should say. And in his chart, he has a very strong Venus. It's a Venus in Pisces. It's exalted. In this sense, it's, you would think that it would be very poetic, because a Venus and Pisces individual is creative. And in some ways he was. I believe he was a pianist, so he was creative. And usually you would think a Venus and Pisces person to be soft, to be sensitive, to be understanding. But in this case, you can always have the lower vibration of a sign come out. And the lower vibration of Pisces is the energy of deception. And there is a lustfulness of Pisces. In more of the traditional branches of astrology, Pisces was considered one of the most sexual signs, and Taurus as well. And he has Jupiter in Taurus. So we can see these two planets, Venus and Jupiter, which are both planets that tend to overdo, that tend to indulge. They're in these kind of more, in these signs that don't tend to be mediated, that are not as good at constraining themselves when it comes to what they want. And it is that appetite that drives people to go into excess. And then there are going to, of course, be other elements of the chart that add in the piece of darkness and corruption. Because excess on its own is not necessarily going to imply that you're going to hurt or take advantage of others in the pursuit of that. But you need both elements. You need a drive towards excess and then a drive towards being evil, basically. And you need to combine those in the chart. So you can see his ability to gain and to want more through this strong Jupiter in Taurus and this Venus in Pisces, where he's amassing really great wealth at this point in time, hundreds of millions of dollars, again, properties all over the world, his own island, his own jet, things of that nature. So he's growing into a place of extreme wealth, and people argue, where was that wealth coming from? And this is where you start to see the corruption take place, because his thing was his relationship connections. It wasn't necessarily that he was, just really good at what he did, but it was that he knew how to network with people in higher, upper echelon of society and higher places than him, who had a lot of money and who had a lot of sick desires. And he also had those sick desires. And so he became kind of this connoisseur, I guess, for bringing young girls to these creepy men, these creepy older men who had a lot of power. And he would, start off by exploiting young and vulnerable, again, artistic women with a vision, or girls. I keep saying women. Please just scratch all the time I say women, say girls. In my head, I just can't imagine a young girl doing that, being involved in this and being subjected to this. But you can see that that spark of dominance in somebody's chart, or the exploitation or abuse of women when we have Mars conjunct Venus, like we have in his chart. Mars is a planet of masculinity. It's a planet of aggression. And again, kind of doing something out of force. And so you can see here that he's using that against the women in his life with this Mars conjunct Venus. And in other charts, that Mars conjunct Venus can indicate a history maybe of, women being overpowered within the family line. It doesn't have to mean that that person perpetuates that. But in this case, with this chart, that is something that he did. He would take advantage and overpower these young women. And when he started his kind of full-on business of basically, I don't know exact words to say for this, but the exploitation and abuse of girls, he was having transiting Pluto make a square to his Mars and Venus conjunction. So again, that aspect can indicate the kind of overpowering of women. And that Pluto square came in and ignited that kind of inner corruption within himself, that poison, because Pluto as a planet is going to bring up all of our shadows. I recently had a Pluto square my Venus transit, and it brought up a lot of issues in my relationship dynamics. And it also showed me where I play a part in the negative circumstances of my life. So it really brings out all the shadows of our inner world. And when this was happening for him, Pluto was moving through the 12th house, which is a very secretive house. So this was happening all behind the scenes. In 2002, Pluto was moving through this secret house, squaring his Mars and Venus and bringing out all of his, again, kind of hunger for more and more and this exploitation of women. And it didn't become known until many, many years later. And as an astrologer, how would you predict when this is going to happen? How do you know that it's not until 2019, 17 years later, right? Yeah, 17 years later that this person is going to be caught? That's such a long time, right? Over a decade, you might not even think that this person is ever going to get caught. But it happens when Pluto moves into his first house. So what's happening here is a rebirthing process or something coming to light, because the ascendant, the first house, is the part of us that I mentioned that the world sees. When a planet is moving as a transiting planet through your 12th into the first, it goes from being in kind of a secretive, hidden state to being birthed into the world, to being seen for the first time. And it also transforms us in a way. But in this case, when you have a lot of corruption, that shadow can become really evident in your world. And people can start to want to fight back because Pluto is a planet of power. And so when it comes and is reborn into your first house, for someone corrupt like this, who has always had the upper hand, who's always over dominated other people, there are finally people who, in this case, girls, who are coming out and standing up for themselves and trying to regain their power back by bringing to light all of the horrible things that he committed. Also during this time, he had Saturn moving through his first house, right over his ascendant. So what happens when we have Saturn moving through the first? Well, Saturn is a planet of karma. So in almost all these examples, you're going to see Saturn and Pluto at play together. But Saturn is a planet of karma, like I mentioned, and it will bring this kind of retribution, this, cause and effect sort of energy. And so when somebody is going through some type of karmic downfall, almost always there's going to be a negative aspect going on with Saturn, because Saturn makes you pay the retribution for what you've done. And so in that first house of his self and his public identity and the way people see him, Saturn is bringing down the hammer. On top of that, we also have the South Node moving through his first house. And the South Node is a point that represents the loss of something. So in this case, he lost really everything. He ended up getting put in jail. But you can see here that the kind of point of the turning point where he fell from grace was when he had Saturn, Pluto, and the South Node moving through his first house over his ascendant. And this is when his empire finally crumbled overnight, even though it had been standing for so many years, over a decade. So when Pluto comes into the first, we can see the darkness coming to light. And when Saturn joins it, we can see the karmic retribution of justice finally being served. So let's go ahead and look at the next person in this scenario, and that is going to be P-Diddy. P-Diddy was born as a Scorpio November of 1969 in New York as well, but in Harlem. He grew up to be somebody who not only was a musician, but somebody who had a lot of power across multiple industries. And unfortunately, he did, of course, end up abusing that power. He started off by building up Bad Boy Records. He also built up fashion lines and vodka brands. And he was somebody who knew how to, I guess, take talent and kind of make them more popular. And on the outside, everything looked really glamorous. You know, he looked successful. He looked likable. And apparently, he had these really big, famous parties that people would attend. But what was going on behind the scenes that people didn't know about was the abuse of his partner and using her for sexual exploits and these things called freak-offs, where she was forced to do really horrible things and he would physically hurt her. And this is something that we, again, can kind of see as a through line between a lot of these charts that we talk about today, is this kind of desire for more and more when it comes to people. And we can see that with Venus conjunct Jupiter in Libra, because as I told you, somebody with quite a lot of Libra energy, or really strong Venus in this case, and a strong Jupiter, they can have these amazing people skills, but they can also, when combined with sexually deviant aspects of the chart, they can also use those people skills to manipulate, to get to these places of power and exploit others. We can see his sexual deviance in many facets in his chart. I think, first of all, having a lot of Scorpio energy does make somebody have oftentimes a larger story in their life around sexuality. And it doesn't mean that they're going to be deviant, but there is a heightened form of sexuality happening here. He also has Saturn in Taurus, and I talked about how Taurus as a sign has trouble managing its appetite with things. It can either be focused on the lack of something, or it can also want more and more. And those things can kind of go hand in hand. So with this strong Libra quality in his chart, he'll attract people. And then that Saturn in Taurus is what makes him kind of hold on to them. And also with this Pluto so close to the South Node, there is a desire to control them. And one of the biggest parts of his chart that is particularly menacing is his Mars at 29 Capricorn. Mars is a planet in charge of all these Scorpio planets. It's the ruler of Scorpio. So in many ways, he's a very Mars dominant person. And Capricorn is the placement or the sign of authority. And 29 degrees is a degree of crisis. So this is an individual who may use too much force or have some kind of crisis around his own authority. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. He used his authority in the music industry to be able to take advantage and abuse the people around him. And it was when his ex, Cassie Ventura, finally stood up for herself. What was going on at that time was Pluto was crossing over his Mars at 29 degrees. And a lot of people were being discovered around this time because, again, Capricorn is about authority, and that also extends to societal authority and governmental institutions or other existing institutions that have the last word or that define how something goes. And when Pluto was moving through Capricorn, especially at that final degree, it was exposing all of the people who had built up their authority and hidden their lies behind that power. And so that's what Pluto does. It can contribute both to the secrets as well as the exposing of those secrets. So in 2023, when Pluto passed over that Mars, this is when Cassie came out and painted that chilling story and even had video evidence of his abuse towards her and the way that he controlled her and forced her to do things that I'm not going to really get into very much right now. But the overall consensus here is that Pluto is going to bring out the the secrets, again, that were hidden behind closed doors. And at the same time, he was having Chiron opposing his Venus and Jupiter in Libra. As I mentioned, that's the placement associated with his strong people skills, his artistry, his ability to make friends, make connections. And Chiron is an asteroid associated with pain and with things breaking down, or with things, again, causing some type of suffering. And so with Chiron aspecting that part of his chart that made him so likable, it shows how the public started to, of course, turn against him as these things were come out into the open about what he contributed to. So finally, on October 3rd of this year, 2025, he was sentenced to 50 months in prison after, of course, Cassie took him to court. And actually, a lot of other people started coming up and saying the things that he did to them. So this event, he was sentenced to 50 months in prison. This sentence, or this event, this trial, was constellated by Saturn opposing his natal Pluto. And that natal Pluto, so close to the South Node, represents that desire for power over others. And it doesn't always have to be bad in somebody's chart if they have that placement, but you will notice a lot of people that we're talking about today that exploit and hurt women and the R word to women, they typically have something going on with their Pluto. Oftentimes Pluto in the 8th or Pluto in the South Node, or maybe Pluto aspecting Saturn or Mars or on the ascendant, that type of thing. And so we can see that in this scenario that Saturn came in opposition with his Pluto and finally called him out on that power and that manipulation and that coercion against women. So Saturn is always going to be involved in some way or another when there's some kind of a trial or karmic retribution for the things that we have done. And in this case, we can, of course, also see that Pluto moving over his Mars was a big factor in that as well for things coming to light. And what's interesting about his chart is that Saturn is also going to be coming into a square to that Mars. So currently Saturn is in Pisces at the time I'm recording this, but it's about to shift into Aries for the next 2 years. And so when Saturn moves to 29 Aries, it's going to form a square with that natal Mars at 29 Capricorn. And this is going to happen in late 2027. It's going to happen in March 2026 till late 2027, off and on. So I find it fascinating that he was sentenced to jail already, because this to me says that it's not over. There is going to be some kind of worsening of the situation when Saturn squares his Mars. It's possible that it could be him trying to fight back, or it could be him trying to somehow gain a lesser sentence, for example. But I think that there is going to be somehow more that comes out to condemn him, or he's going to go through some type of trial by fire, or maybe there's something negative that happens to him in jail. Maybe people gang up on him in jail or do something to him. But I definitely don't think that this story is done, even though he has already been sentenced. So definitely keep an eye out for that March 2026 to late 2027 for more events unfolding around, the karma of Diddy playing out. All right, up next, we're talking about Elizabeth Holmes, who is the only woman in today's video, and very interesting because she was definitely a liar, but she didn't do the kinds of things the men in this video did. But Elizabeth Holmes, if you have seen the movie The Dropout with Amanda Seyfried, this is what it is based off of, this woman's deception. And she was a Stanford dropout who was supposed to be very intelligent. She kind of had this Steve Jobs wannabe thing going on where she was wearing, black turtlenecks every day, and she would deepen her voice and try to sound maybe more masculine in order to kind of gain some type of reputation in the industry. And she ended up saying that she was going to revolutionize medicine. And so she started this company where she said that she was able to do blood test with just a drop of blood and gain all of this kind of information data about that person, or, whatever they needed to test within the blood with simply one drop, which is obviously something that doesn't exist currently. So she was able to convince a bunch of investors to give her millions and millions of dollars. This woman was extremely successful con artist, essentially. And it wasn't until 2015 that people started to question her and her claims. In particular, a journalist, and this was happening when Saturn started squaring her moon. And if you know anything about the moon in astrology, you might know that the moon represents our public, the public in general. And so there was this kind of questioning, right, with that Saturn squaring her moon at that time, that scrutiny that she started to come over. But what made her lie, basically, in the first place? I think a number of things. First of all, she also has Jupiter and Venus together. So we're seeing this theme here with the two benefics together. And we're seeing a strong theme as well with Neptune here. So she has Jupiter, Venus, and Neptune all together in Capricorn. So I think that makes a lot of sense because Capricorn, as I mentioned, represents a lot to do with authority and kind of more traditional structures within society. And obviously medicine, investments, things of that nature tend to fall in line with Capricorn, endeavors, because Capricorn is really, when you're starting to push a lot of money and a lot of investments, you're dealing with Capricorn, Scorpio type things. So this is an individual who understood how to work within that industry, right? She had the ability to kind of know, and even how she deepened her voice, she kind of had the ability to know what was expected of her in a more traditional institutional type place and how to gain esteem or respect, which is a very Capricornian thing. And she used that Neptune, because Neptune is that planet of deception. She used that with that Jupiter, Venus to, again, kind of make her appeal to these individuals and paint the story that they wanted to see. So we can see Neptune very commonly coming in here for people who are good at lying, basically, creating some kind of false image. And again, Neptune isn't always going to play that role in people's lives. It depends on our consciousness, but that was how she started representing herself in this false light. She also has Mars conjunct Saturn in Scorpio. And to me, this is the malevolent aspect of her, the psychologically manipulative aspect of her that wanted control, that wanted to maybe weasel her way into something and then again exploit it, control it, overpower it. And Scorpio can have that manipulative tendency because it understands people really well. And so Scorpio can then use that understanding of human nature to exploit it. Or it can be really supportive, like a therapist, for example. It's going to kind of depend on, again, how that person uses it. So this is an individual who made basically a $1 billion company, but it was all built on lies because she was able to create this illusion for people and, shroud everything in secrecy, very Scorpionic, and exploit people for their money. So she was a financial fraud, basically. And it's crazy because she had a much worse sentence than Diddy, which is just very frustrating. So I mentioned in 2015, a journalist started to look into her claims when Saturn was squaring her moon. That kind of scrutiny of the public happens during that time. And then she was sentenced in January 2022 for 11 years in prison and to pay back millions of dollars. It was either like 170 or 450 million, something like that. But obviously multiple millions of dollars, to the point where if that money is spent, how could you ever get that again? And she's also in prison 11 years, which is crazy because Diddy got mere months in prison. I think it was like a few years or 50 months or something. So you can see here there's a quite stern, sentencing. And not to say that she didn't deserve it, but just, in comparison, I find that interesting. People who've had years and years of, things that they've done wrong, or, more of kind of a human rights issue rather than just financial, they had less punishment. And I think that really has something to deal with what was going on astrologically for her at that time, because you can kind of see in somebody's chart if there's going to be a propensity to have maybe some leniency, or if they're going to go hard. Because if you have kind of a mixture of positive and negative things going on, you might not get as intense of a karmic reaction or as intense of a sentencing. But like I said with the Diddy case, I don't think he got much sentencing at all, in my opinion, but I also don't think that's done yet. I do think he's going to have more come up. But what happened in 2022 for Elizabeth was Saturn was passing over her son at that period of time. And for a normal individual, Saturn passing over your son might mean that you're just working really hard, or that maybe your dad passes away, or that maybe you lose your job or something difficult like that. That's kind of in some ways humbling you, because Saturn likes to do that. In the case with someone like Elizabeth, though, this was a time of retribution, of justice being served. And transiting Saturn and Uranus were also in a square at this time in the sky. So there's this interesting kind of push and pull between what is traditional and what is going to be progressive. And so what this does is it creates this unique tension of not really knowing where we stand with something. And in this case for her, I think it absolutely did not serve her, because Saturn was not only on her sun, but it was also squaring that Mars and Saturn placement of her chart. And so this thing that was kind of creating societal tension of, maybe not knowing again where we stand with something. In this case, it was this transition out of COVID, where a lot of people were having this feeling of wanting to be free, but then we also weren't entirely free. We're kind of stuck between two worlds. It creates a lot of psychic buzzing type of energy that doesn't really have a full outlet. So it creates this kind of nervous tension, this anxiety, this odd mixture of kind of shock with that Uranus and repression or suppression with Saturn. And so she really got the effects of that placement, because again, Saturn was sitting on her sun, and it was also squaring that Mars and Saturn placement. So the reason why I think this was such a difficult time was because of when the sentencing was going down, and also because her natal Mars and Saturn conjunction tends to bring out a more malefic or challenging type of outcome. Mars and Saturn are the malefics, or the more challenging planets of astrology. So when Saturn came in and squared it, and then Uranus opposed it, it was stirring up all of that toxicity within these planets. So she natally had, or was born during it, she natally had this part of her personality that's quite toxic with this placement, and that's what was getting brought up during this time. So we can see again, just to reiterate, January 3rd, 2022, she had Saturn moving over her sun, and then Uranus and squaring her Mars and Saturn, and then also Uranus opposing those planets as well. So we can see this kind of shock and awe in a bad way, but also that karmic retribution of Saturn coming through. The next case that we're going to be talking about is equally disturbing to the others, and this is Dominique Pelicot, and I might be totally mispronouncing his name, because this is a French man, and if you haven't heard of this case, this one is wild for those of you who might not know that they're living with a monster. In the case of Dominique, he was a husband, he was a father, he was a neighbor and a retired engineer, and someone that was part of the community that people trusted. But little did they know that, and little did his wife know, that for over a decade, or for nearly a decade, he had been, to his wife, unknowingly been drugging her. And Giselle, poor woman, was subjected to just horrible atrocities. So he would sedate her very frequently. He'd be texting other men and planning these fantasies where he would share his wife and invite them over to her and film the process. And 72 men and 92 different assaults took place against her, and they were all documented. He documented everything. And of course, she found it at some point, but she was getting sick and she had to go to the doctor because she was like, why don't I feel good? I feel like I'm having these large lapses of memory and I don't know what's going on. And it was because of all the sedatives. And of course, she was actually being altered, not only by the medicine, but those periods of time. And he was actually caught filming up some skirt in the supermarket. And so there were things that kind of slowly put the pieces together, but it took nearly a decade for her to figure it out, for the police to find these thousands of files of videos to see what he had done. And yeah, it's really horrible because, again, he had children with this woman. So imagine that being your dad and you find out that he's been not only raping your mom, but also having other men do the same. And yeah, it's just really, really horrible. And he did say in court that he was also abused as a child. So I think that that's a really common case that we see. People who perpetuate abuse are often victims of it themselves. But I just find this case really fascinating in the sense that it can be an everyday person, you know, somebody in a quiet, sleepy town in France that you know and love, and then you find out you don't know them at all and that you definitely don't love them and that they're a monster. So why did someone like this, or why does he have these tendencies astrologically, and what led to the kind of revelation of these things and the downfall? So in his chart, we can also see that he has Saturn and Neptune in Libra. So very similar chart to Jeffrey Epstein. He also has Pluto conjunct the South Node in Leo. Both of these two shared these placements. So whenever we, again, have Saturn and Neptune together, we have somebody who, in this Libra placement, we have somebody who maybe has a knack for people. And, you know, as a Libra rising, again, this is a lot around kind of how he presents himself. You wouldn't maybe necessarily suspect all of that darkness within him. And he has this desire for power. And not only that, but the filming piece, you know, the wanting to go through sexual exploits and, you know, have your wife be part of that. That's the power piece of Pluto. But being in Leo, in the South Node in Leo, there's something about watching or being seen doing it, involving other people in the act of it, you know, voyeurism, I should say. So there's something about like Pluto in Leo, South Node in Leo, that represents that kind of sexual tendency towards more than just, oh, this is something that I want to do this person, but like making it a more public affair, because Leo is a sign, the kind of visible sign, right, where you want people to witness, to admire. But in this case, it's obviously quite toxic. So we can see that sickness playing out here for him. And when he was, and then one other thing, he also has Jupiter in Taurus. So we also talked about Jupiter in Taurus creating this difficulty of like knowing when to stop, when enough is enough, like wanting more and more and more, and having such an incessant hunger that it, paired with other elements of the chart, can create that, you know, the Machiavellian exploitative kind of personality type to get what you want in this scenario. So again, this is particularly interesting because of how long he was able to get away with this. And same thing with Epstein's chart. And we can see, again, so much overlap is that both of these individuals, it took quite a while for things to come to light. And it wasn't until, you know, the court case began in September 2024 that he was able to finally have this all publicized, right? And to have his shame brought to light. So during that period in time, in September 2024, he had Chiron opposite that Saturn and Neptune in Libra conjunction. And this is very similar transit to one of the previous people I mentioned, because that Saturn, Neptune in Libra indicates the people pleasing or being pleasing to people in the sense that he looks a certain way that people wouldn't suspect something negative from him. But then Chiron, again, that asteroid that creates pain or wounding or breaks something down, coming into opposition with that placement, is going to expose the darkness there, is going to tarnish his reputation in this kind of public fashion. So again, we can see this same type of transit showing that there's a public fall from grace. He received a 20-year sentence, which I believe is the maximum in France, on December 19th, 2024, right before Christmas. And on this day, Pluto was exactly trining his ascendant at 0 Libra, Pluto was 0 Aquarius. And we can see time and time again, Pluto by transit is going to expose the truth, for better or for worse. It doesn't mean it has to be against you. Pluto can also expose a truth that is hidden in the shadows that is actually in your favor. But in this case, obviously, Pluto trining the ascendant in this case was showing that he had hidden these parts of himself, and it exposed it. He also had Uranus opposite his Venus at this time. So in 2024. So you can see that there was this kind of shocking element towards his family, because Venus is in his family sector, towards his relationships. There's this quality of being not only shocked, but exposed in some type of way, and especially because Uranus also squared his Pluto. So again, there's this feeling of exposure, of the toxic energy coming to light. So yeah, the last thing I'll mention, that he also had Saturn squaring his Mercury at the time of his sentence, which typically indicates bad news. So obviously bad news for him, good news for Giselle, his victim, his wife. And this just shows you that you don't really know who somebody is. And you also don't know when is the time of karma until you see something like this take place. So astrology shows that with Saturn and Pluto involved, we all have a time of reckoning. And when you track these planets and their transits, you can gather a sense of when somebody is going to go through some type of public accumulation, downfall, or karmic retribution for the things that they have done wrong. So I hope that this video is interesting to you guys. If you enjoy this type of content, let me know in the comments down below. Please also like and subscribe. But yeah, I'm really curious if this content is any way interesting or how I can improve it, because I feel like, of course, I can definitely improve it. So let me know, and I will see you guys next week.